The upscale neighborhood of Brentwood, Los Angeles, is a place where security is measured in high walls and silent alarms. But on the afternoon of December 14th, 2025, that silence became heavy with an unbearable weight. The house at the end of the street. Once a sanctuary for one of Hollywood's most beloved storytellers, stood as a quiet witness to a tragedy that few could have predicted, yet some had deeply feared. When the doors were finally opened, the world did not just lose a legendary filmmaker, it lost a sense of security that had anchored a generation of cinema. Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, were gone, leaving behind a legacy of laughter and a scene described by those close to the investigation as a true Hollywood nightmare. For nearly 50 years, the name Rob Reiner was synonymous with the heart of American film. From the wit of When Harry Met Sally to the timeless nostalgia of Stand By Me. Beside him for almost all of those decades was his closest friend and creative partner, Billy Crystal. They were a team that defined an era. But as the lights dimmed on Rob's life, it was Billy who was left standing in the shadows of a final, private conversation. Just 2 weeks before the tragedy, on a Sunday afternoon that seemed ordinary to the rest of the world, Rob had reached out with a directness that shattered their usual routine. What followed was a secret confession, a raw, unfiltered look into a family dynamic that had been quietly spiraling toward a breaking point. Billy Crystal did not just hear a friend's venting. He saw the exhaustion of a father who could no longer predict the reactions of the son he had spent a lifetime trying to protect. Today, we look past the headlines and the tributes from presidents and peers to examine the hours and days that led to that final silence in Brentwood. We explore the warning signs that were whispered in private and the burden of hindsight that Billy Crystal now carries. Asking the question that haunts every survivor of such a loss, could the outcome have been changed? If the warnings had been louder, to understand the depth of the tragedy that unfolded in mid-December. One must look back to a specific Sunday afternoon on November 30th, 2025. According to private recollections shared by Billy Crystal, that day marked a significant departure from the decades of easy friendship he had enjoyed with Rob Reiner. It began with a phone call initiated by Rob that was notably brief and unsettlingly direct. Rob did not call to discuss a new script or a political cause. Instead, he told Billy simply that he needed to talk and explicitly stated it was not about movies. When Billy arrived at the Brentwood home shortly after 4 p.m., the atmosphere was immediately different. The man who opened the door was not the confident, orderly filmmaker the public knew, but a man who looked worn down, his shirt wrinkled, and his hair unkempt. The physical toll of ongoing stress was evident in the way Rob moved and spoke. Billy noted that their usual greeting, a firm handshake, felt weak, as if Rob was physically drained by a burden he had been carrying in silence. Inside the house, the familiar comforts were missing. There was no music playing and no television on routines that usually defined Billy's visits to the Reiner household. Rob poured a glass of water but never drank it, his eyes constantly drifting toward the hallway that led into the deeper, more private parts of the home. It was a level of tension Billy had never witnessed in his friend's private sanctuary. When Rob finally spoke, his voice was lower and rougher than usual, as he admitted that his family life was a mess, and he was utterly exhausted. He confessed that his son, Nick Reiner, had experienced a serious setback earlier that November, which had drastically altered the domestic environment. Rob described a home life that had become a battlefield of sudden irritability and short tempers. He revealed that the tension had become so intense that Michelle often had to step away just to prevent arguments from escalating further. One specific incident, a heated disagreement over finances and care that occurred just before Thanksgiving, had left Rob deeply unsettled. He admitted to Billy that he reached a point where he could no longer predict how his son would react to even the simplest conversation. As Rob spoke, he frequently fell into long silences, staring at the floor with a look not of anger, but of profound exhaustion. He explained his desperate hope that keeping Nick close to the family would help him regain his balance. But he also voiced a chilling fear. Rob told Billy that he was afraid if he pushed his son away, he would be the one responsible for the young man's total collapse. Seeing his friend in such a fragile state, Billy responded with a firmness he had rarely used in their 50-year history. He looked Rob in the eye and warned him plainly that by maintaining this silence and refusing to set boundaries, he was placing both himself and Michelle in a risky situation. Billy urged his friend to understand that the behaviors being described inside the home could not be brushed aside as simple family friction. He argued that while trusting family bonds was natural, the current situation required professional intervention and clear limits. Rob listened, his eyes visibly strained, but he ultimately could not bring himself to view his son as a danger. He expressed a deep-seated fear that even one wrong move on his part could send Nick's life spiraling out of control. The meeting ended in a heavy, unresolved stillness. As Billy left the Brentwood house that evening, an uneasy feeling followed him, a premonition that something was quietly unfolding beneath the surface that might soon become impossible to contain. The weight Rob Reiner carried during that final conversation with Billy Crystal was the culmination of a 32-year journey defined by a father's unwavering but agonizing devotion. Nicholas Reiner, born in 1993, had long been the central focus of Rob's deepest anxieties. Over the decades, Rob had often confided in Billy about the cyclical nature of Nick's life, a series of repeated setbacks and hard-fought attempts to find stability that eventually wore down the emotional reserves of the entire family. There were periods when Nick would nearly vanish from their lives, moving restlessly from place to place and cutting off contact for long, silent stretches. This history created a permanent state of high alert within the Brentwood home, where every period of calm felt like the preamble to an inevitable storm. For Rob, the line between his role as a father and his identity as a storyteller often blurred as he searched for a way to reach his son. This search resulted in the film Being Charlie, a project that Billy Crystal viewed not as a mere creative endeavor, but as a father's desperate final attempt to guide his son toward a lasting peace. The film was semi-autobiographical, intended to serve as a turning point where the family's struggles could be transformed into a shared understanding. Rob hoped that by putting their pain on screen, they could finally leave it behind. Yet the deeper issues remained unresolved, simmering beneath the surface of their daily routines. In the months leading up to December 2025, the internal pressure within the household began to shift from a manageable concern to an unpredictable force. Rob admitted to Billy that the atmosphere inside the home would occasionally become eerily still, a silence that felt heavy and unnatural. He confessed that he had lost the ability to anticipate how Nick would react when the pressures of life reached a breaking point, a realization that left Rob feeling drained of hope but still unwilling to step away. He felt trapped by the belief that his presence was the only thing preventing Nick from a total collapse. A sentiment that made the idea of setting boundaries feel like an act of abandonment. This prolonged emotional strain began to manifest in physical ways that Billy could not help but notice. The order and confidence that had always defined Rob's professional and personal life were being chipped away by the constant vigilance required at home. Even as Billy watched his friend's health and spirit decline, Rob continued to frame the situation through the lens of family loyalty. He viewed Nick's volatility not as a danger to be feared, but as a symptom of the many painful periods the young man had already endured. This perspective allowed the warning signs to stack up quietly, hidden away from the public eye and even from the couple's closest friends. By the time late 2025 arrived, the cracks in the foundation were becoming visible to those who knew where to look. The private confessions Rob made to Billy were the only outlets for a reality that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The tension moved from room to room in the Brentwood house, unfolding in stages that Rob had once described as a slow, inevitable progression. Despite Billy's firm warnings that the situation was becoming a risky situation, Rob's commitment to his son remained absolute. He chose to believe that love and proximity would eventually be enough to steady the scales, unaware that the final point in this long chain of warnings was rapidly approaching. The festive lights and holiday cheer of Saturday, December 13, 2025, provided a hauntingly sharp contrast to the events that were about to unfold. That evening, Rob and Michelle Reiner attended a holiday gathering hosted by Conan O'Brien. While Nick Reiner was present alongside his parents, the evening quickly took a turn as his behavior became increasingly unsettled. Eyewitnesses recalled a tense exchange between Rob and Nick, a public manifestation of the private struggles Rob had recently confessed to Billy Crystal. Hearing about this incident later deeply unsettled Billy, as it mirrored exactly what Rob had described about moments when his son became difficult to manage. As the night progressed, the internal family dynamics that had been quietly intensifying for years reached a visible peak. Reports indicated that Nick appeared emotionally unstable during the gathering, a detail that many would only recognize as a critical warning sign after the tragedy was discovered. It is now understood that Nick left the Brentwood area before anyone outside the home became aware of the situation, a movement that aligned with previous patterns of emotional overload. This departure marked the final hours of the life Rob and Michelle had built together, turning a night of community and celebration into the definitive breaking point. The transition from a high-profile holiday party to a crime scene occurred in the span of less than 24 hours, leaving the quiet streets of Brentwood in a state of shock. On the afternoon of Sunday, December 14, 2025, the routine of the Reiner household was abruptly shattered when someone arrived for a scheduled visit, knocked repeatedly, and received no response. This unusual silence from a couple known for their consistent routines and steady rhythm of life immediately raised concerns among those who knew them best. The full scale of the tragedy was realized when Rob and Michelle's daughter, Romy, entered the residence. According to accounts of that afternoon, Romy encountered her father first and fled the house in immense distress. It was only later, during a more thorough search of the property, that Michelle was discovered in another part of the house. This physical separation suggested to close friends like Billy Crystal that the events did not happen to both of them at the same moment, but rather unfolded in stages, a pattern that hauntingly mirrored the way Rob had once described the slow movement of tension through their home. The technical details of the scene were grim, and investigators zeroed in on the sequence of events during the 24 hours before the discovery. Billy Crystal noted that the furniture and surrounding spaces appeared largely untouched, which he interpreted as evidence that no outside presence had been involved. To him, the familiarity of the setting made the violence all the more disturbing. It suggested that the tragedy had unfolded within the ordinary habits of their daily lives. The significant delay between the incident and its discovery brought Billy back to Rob's own words about the eerily still atmosphere that sometimes took hold of the home when pressures were at their peak. When news of the discovery became public, the immediate reaction from the entertainment world was one of total disbelief. It was a scene that did not resemble the Rob Reiner his peers had known for decades, the man of laughter, logic, and deep compassion. As the Brentwood area was cordoned off, the focus shifted to the one missing piece of the puzzle, Nick's absence from the home when everything came to light. For Billy Crystal, this detail was the final confirmation of his worst fears, connecting back to that afternoon in November when Rob admitted he could no longer anticipate his son's reactions during moments of intense pressure. For Billy Crystal, the tragedy was not just a headline, it was a deeply personal shattering of a 50-year brotherhood. In the days following the discovery, Billy retreated into a heavy silence, withdrawing from his usual routines and skipping year-end gatherings as he struggled to process the loss. The grief was compounded by a haunting sense of hindsight. Friends noted that Billy repeatedly replayed his final private conversation with Rob, remembering the director's tired eyes and the specific warnings Billy himself had raised about the volatility within the home. He reportedly criticized himself for not pushing harder, for believing that Rob's immense love for his son would be enough to keep the situation steady. This sense of helplessness of having noticed the signs and spoken up, yet being unable to change the outcome, became a burden heavier than the loss itself. Billy eventually chose to speak through a joint statement signed alongside longtime collaborators like Albert Brooks, Martin Short, and Larry David. The tribute did not focus on the violence, but on honoring a bond that had endured for nearly a lifetime. They described Rob as a master storyteller and honored Michelle as his perfect partner in family life and civic causes. To capture the magnitude of the absence, the group turned to a line from one of Rob's favorite films, "It's a Wonderful Life." Each man's life touches so many other lives, and when he isn't around, he leaves an awful hole, doesn't he? Despite the public tribute, the personal toll on Billy remains visible. He has declined television appearances, reportedly telling those close to him that he is not yet ready to speak Rob's name without losing his composure. Each mention brings back memories and a renewed sense of guilt for not being there when things slowly slipped beyond control. For Billy, the space Rob left is an immeasurable hole in daily life. An unfinished conversation between two friends who thought they still had plenty of time. The legacy of Rob Reiner is a tapestry woven from the very fabric of American imagination. A career that spanned more than 5 decades and redefined multiple genres of cinema. From the groundbreaking wit of his television work to the cultural milestones he directed, his work brought heart and humanity to the screen. Yet, the tragic silence that fell upon the Brentwood estate serves as a devastating reminder that even the most cherished storytellers are not immune to the complexities of real-life suffering. Rob and Michelle Reiner lived with uncommon loyalty and shared purpose, qualities that were evident until the very end. The secret confession shared with Billy Crystal just weeks before the end highlights a painful truth that often goes unseen in the presence of love and success. It is a narrative of a father's greatest fear, a struggle to maintain balance in the face of invisible suffering, and a refusal to give up on a child. As Hollywood mourns the loss of 2 of its most generous hearts, the story shifts from the cinematic to the deeply human, leaving behind a legacy that demands we look closer and listen longer to those in pain. Billy Crystal's heavy burden of hindsight is a sentiment shared by an entire industry that is now both richer for having known Rob Reiner and profoundly poorer for having lost him. We invite you to honor the memory of Rob and Michelle Reiner by sharing your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. Whether it was the laughter of a classic comedy or the inspiration of their social activism, their impact on our world remains immeasurable. If you would like to follow more stories and in-depth investigations into the lives of those who shaped our culture, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. Thank you for joining us as we remember a master storyteller whose final chapter was a tragedy no one could have scripted.